I want to continue discussing what we started last week, what we briefly brought up about the concept of Mashiach, and how do we really understand this idea? Does a Jew have to believe in the concept of Mashiach? Is it mandatory? Is it really a fundamental principle? Like if you don't believe in a Messiah, in the coming of a Messiah, then that makes you a heretic? Or maybe not. Like, can I be a good Jew and not believe in Mashiach? And how do we understand this idea? And how was it understood throughout history? Going back in time and actually exploring how this idea evolved. And how did people understand the coming of the Messiah in the last 2,500 years? So we briefly mentioned last week that the Sadducees, 2,000 years ago, there were the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes. And the Sadducees did not accept the concept of Mashiach. The Pharisees, the Prushim did, the Esseim did. The Sadducees did not accept Mashiach. Why did they not accept Mashiach? Because Mashiach is not actually mentioned in the Chumash. Remember, the Sadducees were those that held strictly to the written Torah. They believed that they would only keep, only the laws written in the Torah have to be kept, and they rejected any oral traditions. And because the Torah itself, the 5 books of Moses, don't speak of Mashiach, they rejected the whole notion. The word Mashiach, as we mentioned last week, does appear in the Torah several times, but only in conjunction with the Kohen Mashiach, the anointed high priest. But it's not referring to any king or any redeemer, not on the surface anyways. So we're just in terms of Jewish law, and we agree on that we only take laws from the Chumash, technically. We can use verses in Nach to support the laws, but new laws are not derived from Nach.
Isn't the Ark of Prophets mentioning Ben David?
Yes, exactly. So the Nach, so that's what we want to explore. So the Nach then does speak about Mashiach, the Nevi'im and Ketuvim do, but the actual Chumash, the 5 books of Moses, don't. Okay?
Why would they not accept Ben David? They accept Nach.
So let's see. That's what we want to. That's one of the things that we want to explore. And so 2,000 years ago, there were some Jews that didn't accept the idea of a Mashiach. The majority did, but some didn't. And we see that opinion even in the Talmud. Even later on in the Talmud, we see in several places that we're going to quote that we saw one last week, and I want to bring up a couple more, that there are some people didn't hold that you have to believe in a Messiah back then. So we mentioned in Sanhedrin at the end, in page 98, where Rabbi Hillel says, Ein Mashiach leIsrael, where the sages are discussing Mashiach, Rabbi Hillel says, you don't have to wait for Mashiach. Ein Mashiach leIsrael. Why? Shekvar achluhu beyamei Chizkiyahu. Because we already enjoyed Mashiach in Hezekiah. The king Hezekiah, as we said last week, was the greatest king. The Tanakh describes him as the greatest king since King David. The Tanakh says there was no king as great as him before him or after him. And he destroyed all the idols, and he purified the land, and he subdued Israel's enemies. So this idea was current 2,000 years ago that maybe Hezekiah was the Messiah, and that all the prophecies, or most of the prophecies in the Tanakh about Mashiach were fulfilled in Hezekiah himself, including the prophecies of Isaiah. And we discussed that last week. That Hezekiah, the king Hezekiah, who lived about more than 2,500 years ago, the Nach is actually speaking about him, about Hezekiah, because he is literally the anointed king, Mashiach ben David, the rightful descendant of King David, who restored the glory of Israel, of Judah, in his day. So Rabbi Hillel believed that Hezekiah fulfilled the conditions of the Messiah in his day, and that the prophecies in the Tanakh are really speaking about him. There are also later prophecies after Isaiah and Hezekiah. So who are those talking about? The prophecies about Mashiach at the beginning of the Second Temple era, between the First and Second Temple, in the late prophets. Who are they talking about? And if you remember, we read on Chanukah, on Shabbat Chanukah, what's the haftarah that we read on Shabbat Chanukah? It's from Zechariah, the prophet, and we read there about Yehoshua HaKohen, the high priest. You remember that? You've all read this many times, that God gave a vision to Yehoshua showing him a menorah. You remember this? When they're rebuilding the Second Temple. And so you've read this all before. Shmana Yehoshua Kohen HaGadol, Ata v'recha yoshvim lefanecha, ki anshei mofet hema, ki hineni mavi et avdi tzemach. God is saying, I'm bringing for you my servant tzemach, the sprout. And tzemach is always used as an epithet for Mashiach. One of the epithets, one of the names, one of the titles of Mashiach is Tzemach. In fact, some people today use Tzemach as a given name. They'll name include it, especially in Chabad. Anybody know why? Yes and no. More specifically to our generation. Because the Lubavitcher Rebbe, of course, many Chabadnikim think that he's Mashiach, and his name was Menachem, and the Gematria of Menachem is 138, and Tzemach is 138. So it's also like encoding, it's the same value as Menachem, right? So in a typical like Lubavitcher family, one of the first sons will be called Menachem Mendel, or Menachem, or Mendel, and then one of the later sons might be called Tzemach. It's like another way of, because it has the same numerical value as Menachem actually. And Tzemach is, the Talmud actually says, Menachem is one of the potential names of the Messiah. And Tzemach is another title of the Messiah. However, who is this Tzemach? God is giving Yoshua HaKohen a prophecy and saying, I'm sending you the Tzemach. And who is this Tzemach? Who is this servant of mine? And I'm just skipping ahead a few verses. Vaya'an vayomer elai laimor zed davar Hashem el Zerubbabel. This is the word of God to a man who's not known so much today. His name was Zerubbabel. And he told them, Lo b'chayil velo b'koach, ki im beruchi amar Hashem tzvaot, that God is going to come not by military might, but through His Holy Spirit. He will come to Zerubbabel. V'yidvar Hashem elai le'emor, that Yedei Zerubbabel yasdu habayit hazeh. God is saying that Zerubbabel will rebuild this temple, will rebuild the second temple. Ve'yadata ki Hashem tzvaot shlachani alechem. And you will know that God has sent Zerubbabel as this messenger who is filled with the Spirit of God and rebuilds the second temple. And Zerubbabel was actually the grandson of the last king of Judah, and he's also a descendant of King David. He was appointed as the governor of Judea in the Persian period. So he really fulfilled, again, many of those conditions of being the Messiah of his day. He was the leader of Israel. He was a descendant of King David. He rebuilt the temple. So Zerubbabel, in his generation, was hoped to be the Messiah. And this prophecy in Zechariah is really making it seem like Zerubbabel will be Mashiach. So some would say that he fulfilled the requirements of Mashiach in his day. And so going back to the Sadducees, it could very well be that they held that everything that the Nach says about, that the prophets say about the Messiah, was already fulfilled in Hezekiah and Zerubbabel. And the Tanakh tells a complete story, essentially, from the very beginnings of the universe and mankind, and then the Jewish people, the Israelites, and the kingdom, the temples, the destruction of the temples, the return to Israel, and the rebuilding of the temple, and the reestablishment of a autonomous or semi-autonomous Jewish state under the leadership of the descendant of King David. So you could hold that the Tanakh actually tells a complete picture. And all the prophecies of exile and return were about the first exile, the Babylonian exile, and the rebuilding of the second temple. Right? So that's how the Sadducees would have interpreted it. And they wouldn't have thought of a future third temple or a future Messiah, which is probably why the Sadducees didn't survive the destruction of the temple. One of the philosophical reasons, and there are many others. Yeah?
What about Yechezkel's vision of the third? Isn't there a vision of the third?
Was it the vision of the third or of the second? We interpret it as a vision of the third. But why could it not be the vision of the second temple, right? Because he was prophesying between the first and second temple. So the truth is, the pshat is that he was talking about the second temple. It's just that those dimensions were not actually the second temple didn't actually look like that. So then we say that no, those were the third that was really a prophecy for the third temple. But the pshat is that he was really saying this is what the second temple should be like. It just never reached that glory.
So you're putting here that we could have had several messiahs during the story.
So it's possible that in the generation of Isaiah, people saw Hezekiah as the Messiah. And in the generation of the start of the second temple, the Anshei Knesset Agdola saw Zerubbabel as the Messiah. And the Anshei Knesset Agdola, if you remember, there was a council of 120. It was basically the Great Sanhedrin at the start of the Second Temple era, with 120 sages and the last prophets that put together the Tanakh. When they would have put together the Tanakh as they did, why did they put it together that way in these 24 books and these particular texts? And why did they not include other texts? We know that they rejected certain books from being in the Tanakh. Why did they put it up? Because it seems like they wanted to tell a complete story. The Tanakh really tells a complete story from start to finish. And it's quite possible that they believed they were already, for them, in the Messianic age. The exile was over, they were back in Israel, the temple was rebuilt. They had a Jewish governor who was a descendant of King David. So to them, it could have very well seemed like we are in the Messianic age.
Who would have decided that? Who's them?
The Anshe Knesset HaGdolah, which was the last prophets. There were prophets among them, like Zechariah. Zechariah was one of them. And Zechariah is giving a prophecy here that Zerubbabel is Avdi Tzemach, is the Messiah, essentially.
What about, for example, like something like unification of the staff of Judah or the staff of Joseph?
Yeah, I think they could have interpreted all of that, as what was happening with them. Because remember, at that time, everybody became a Yehudi. And all the tribes now melted away, and there was no longer any tribal affiliation. So they could have seen that prophecy fulfilled in the fact that everybody now is a Yehudi, and we're no longer divided by tribes, and we're no longer going to fight each other like we used to, and we're not going to have civil wars anymore. We're just one entity. Yeah, exactly. So I think they had that notion, that positive, optimistic idea, and I think that's how they interpreted it, that all the tribes now are one, under that one banner of Yehuda. But then, of course, what happened is it wasn't the Messianic era, and things got bad, turned really bad again. The Greeks first, and then, the Persians first, and then the Greeks, and then the Romans. And so by the time you get to the Roman era, people realize that this isn't it. And those prophecies would have probably been reinterpreted as, no, it wasn't it. They must have been talking about a future Messianic age, because clearly this was not the Messianic age.
That's a pretty good conclusion.
Right. And so we know at the end of the Second Temple era, there was a huge Messianic fervor, not among the Sadducees who didn't accept Mashiach, but by then the Pharisees and the Essenes were very much waiting for Mashiach to come and save them from the Romans. So at the end of the Second Temple now, there's this huge Messianic fervor among Pharisees, Essenes, Zealots, and others. And that's why Josephus, who was alive at the time and is an eyewitness and is our best eyewitness source, we really have two great eyewitnesses to the Second Temple era, which is Josephus and Philo. And so they're not so accepted in the Orthodox world, but as a historical text, they're fantastic to understand what Judaism was like 2,000 years ago, because they're telling you what was going on. And Philo as well, we mentioned him before, he describes very beautifully Judaism. Some people call him the first Torah commentator, really, even though he wrote in Greek. But he was a Jew. And Josephus is the other one, who was this Jew who kind of was a traitor and turned Roman and lived out the rest of his life in Rome after the Great Revolt, after the temple was destroyed. And Josephus, as we discussed in the past, Josephus mentions like a dozen different people who claimed to be Messiah or who had messianic followings around them, and all kinds of people. Some had big followings of thousands and tens of thousands of people, and some not so much, and none of them worked out. Right? But there was such a huge expectation for Mashiach to come in the Roman era because the persecutions were so intense and so terrible. And shortly after that, we remember there was the next great war between Israel and Rome was the Bar Kokhba revolt. And you had Bar Kokhba, who was, again, a potential Messiah. He managed to expel the Romans. He managed to clear the Temple Mount. He started rebuilding the temple. And Rabbi Akiva, at the time, of course, declared him to be the Messiah. And that's a very famous or perhaps infamous period of Jewish history, because the great Rabbi Akiva, who really all of Judaism is built on him, because he is credited with really establishing the 6 orders of the Mishnah and teaching those 5 or 6 students that rebuilt all of Judaism after the Bar Kokhba revolt in this horrible time. And so Rabbi Akiva declared Bar Kokhba as at least the presumptive Messiah. And the Talmud Yerushalmi says this, Tanei Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. So Rashbi, Shimon bar Yochai, he's one of the students of Rabbi Akiva, and he said, Akiva Rabbi Hayad Doresh, my Rabbi Akiva would teach the verse in Numbers, in Bilam's prophecy, Drach Kochav mi Yaakov, that a star will come out of Jacob, which is one of the places in Chumash where we interpret that as referring to the Messiah, the star of Jacob. And Rabbi Akiva would say, Drach Kochav mi Yaakov, Drach Koziba mi Yaakov, or Kozba, Drach Kozba mi Yaakov, that Shimon bar Koziba or they named him Bar Kochva. They named him the son of the star because he is the Messiah. So Rabbi Akiva, it's almost like Rabbi Akiva is the one who gave him that name. Rabbi Akiva renamed him to Shimon Bar Kochva, son of the star, to fulfill this prophecy that he is the Drach Kochav miYaakov. He is the star of Jacob, the Messiah. Kad havachame Bar Kozba, when he would see Bar Kochba, he would say, Din hu Malkam Shicha. He is the Messiah. Rabbi Akiva would say he is the Messiah. And what do you think the response was from one of his contemporaries? Amar lo Rabbi Yochanan ben Torta. Rabbi Yochanan responded to him. He said, Akiva, Ya'alu asabim belechayecha ve'adayin ben David lo yavo. He said, Akiva, that's great wishful thinking. You will be long gone. Grass will grow out of your cheeks, and Mashiach still will not be here. Right? So, weeds, and grass and weeds will grow out of your cheeks, and Mashiach still won't come. Which, how do you interpret? Does that mean that he thinks that Rabbi Yochanan believes that Mashiach would come far in the future, when Rabbi Akiva has already decomposed? Or does he mean, is he like Rabbi Hillel in Sanhedrin, who thinks that Mashiach will never come? Meaning, even when you've decomposed, still there will be no Messiah. Meaning, it's great wishful thinking, but there will never be a Messiah. So stop waiting for something that's not going to happen.
Well, what do you take from it? Because I think
Let's
it says, after Yamim Rabim, Velach Shah, there's always these prophecies that tell.
Right. Bilam said that I see it, but not now. I see it in Acharit Hayamim, in the end of days. The problem with that is every generation interprets itself as being in the end of days. We are literally at the end of days. We're at the end of time, in the present. So each generation could interpret it to apply to themselves. Right? And so, going back to this, we now see a couple of places in Talmud where apparently there's an opinion that maybe there is no Mashiach, or that Mashiach was already fulfilled in the Tanakh itself. The story of the Messiah is already done. Now, that was rejected. As we know, the Rambam totally rejected that. And he wrote in his 13 Principles of Faith that you have to believe that a Messiah will come one day, or you are a heretic. If you do not accept that there will be a Messiah, you are a heretic. Okay? Why did he write that as a fundamental belief? We can discuss. But Rav Yosef Albo, and this is what we mentioned briefly last week, Rav Yosef Albo wrote kind of like a counter text or a parallel text called Sefer HaIkarim, the Book of Principles. He wrote a full, intense analysis of the principles, and he argues that there are really only 3 root principles. There's only 3 things that if you don't believe in, then you are a heretic. Number 1 is believing in God. You must believe in one God, the Creator God. Right? Number 2 is you must believe that the Torah is divine, and that God gives us divine revelation and communicates to prophets that the Torah is divine. And number 3, you have to believe in reward and punishment, that the sinners will get punished for their wickedness and the righteous will get rewarded for their good deeds. So Rav Yosef Albo says these are truly the only 3 fundamental principles that a Jew must believe in. If you don't believe in these things, you are a heretic for sure. Kofer beikar, you are a heretic. But he says, what about believing in Mashiach? Do you have to? He says it's a side belief, it's a branch. You should believe it. His words are, I'll read you his exact words. He says, it is clear that he who does not believe in the coming of the Messiah denies the works of the prophets and contravenes a positive command. But nevertheless, the belief in the Messiah is not a principle which if a man denies, he denies the Torah. And he says a man who denies the coming of the Messiah cannot be called a kofer beikar, who denies the fundamental faith. So Rav Yosef Albo holds that there's only those 3 things that you must believe in, and believing in a Messiah, not necessarily. If you don't want to, you should. It's a good thing to believe, but do you really have to? You could theoretically be, according to at least Rav Yosef Albo and others who were on his side, you could be a good Jew without waiting for a Messiah to come.
But what about, for instance, how it states that only if you believe in Tchiyat HaMetim, you're going to end up having Olam Haba. So you could be a good Jew in this realm, but you could basically
so you can't
condemn yourself not to have an Olam Haba, basically.
So Tchiyat HaMetim is a different thing. That's part of reward and punishment. Right. So he holds that as well as a secondary belief under reward and punishment. Right? Now, the Mishnah itself in Sanhedrin, in that same Sanhedrin, in Perek Chelek, that whole chapter about Kol Yisrael Yesh Lahem Chelek Le'olam Haba, the first Mishnah there says also there's 3 things that a Jew must believe in. And one of them is the resurrection of the dead. And one is the Torah. that you have to believe that the Torah is divine. You have to believe that there will be a future resurrection of the dead. And then it gives a general thing where you can't be an apikoros. What does an apikoros mean, though? That's where that's open to interpretation. Like, what is an apikoros exactly? But the two things that for sure are clear is Tchiyat HaMetim and that the Torah is divine. That's the first Mishnah over there in Perek Chelek. So Rav Yosef Albo holds that you don't necessarily have to believe in a Messiah. And he was supported by another rabbi, Rabbi Avraham of Viterbo, and he wrote a book called Emunat Chachamim, where he was also very opposed to the Rambam's. The whole idea of having 13 principles of faith, the general rule is that Judaism is not a religion of creed, it's a religion of deed. That's the old saying, that we have all kinds of beliefs, and the Talmud is full of all kinds of beliefs and opinions, sometimes wildly different opinions, irreconcilable opinions, and so that's okay. We're totally fine with having different opinions. So that's why there's this old saying that Judaism is not a religion of creed. Like, what you believe is not so important. It's secondary. It's a religion of deed. The whole point is fulfilling God's law. As long as you're doing the mitzvot, that's the important thing. And the beliefs are important, but they're secondary. The creed is secondary to the deed, whereas Christianity and Islam are kind of the other way. They're creed first. And you see that in the conversion process. To become a Christian or to become a Muslim, it's a pretty quick recipe. You just have to take upon yourself the creed, and it can be done in a split second. But to be a Jew, it's really, nobody really grills you on what you believe. It's about your deeds. It's about taking upon yourself the mitzvahs, and it's usually a long process, a year or two. And once you're actually doing the mitzvot, then you're given the conversion. Because the deed is more important than the beliefs. And there are various midrashim, again, that support this idea as well. One example, Midrash Tanchuma, says, Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God said, Be'olam hazeh, in this world, Ayitem nosha'im al yadei bnei adam. You were saved, throughout history, you were saved by people. Be'mitzrayim al yadei Moshe ve'Aharon. In Egypt, who saved you? I sent Moses and Aaron. Be'amei Sisra, in the days of Judges, Sisra was one of the worst ones, meaning one of the worst oppressors of Israel. Al yadei Barak u'Dvorah. Barak and Dvorah saved you in the time of Sisera, right? B'midyanim al yadei Shamgar. That's another one of the judges, Shamgar. And all the time v'chen al yadei shoftim. God always sent various people. Ve'al yadei shehayu basar v'dam ayitem chozrim u'mishta'abdin aval atid lavo. But in the future, ani be'atzmi goel etchem. God is saying, I myself will save you. V'shuv ein atem mishta'abdin shene'emar, and you will never be sent into exile or slavery, let's say. You will never be subdued again, because, and the Midrash quotes a pasuk in Isaiah, chapter 45, Israel nosha behashem, tshuat olamim. Okay? That you will have the tshuat olamim, the everlasting salvation, only through Hashem. God himself will save us at the end. Okay? That's a very interesting Midrash, because it's saying, don't expect a person. In the past, I would send people to save you. But at the end of days, it'll be me, myself. God will save you. And that's kind of how we concluded the last class, right? You don't necessarily have to believe in a person to save you. You really just need to have faith in God, in Hashem, to save you. Now, having said that, we still hold that Mashiach has to come. And to suggest otherwise, today you would probably get branded as a heretic if you say that there's no human Messiah. Although, as we saw, there's many early sources that don't hold that way. So, for sure, the Davidic dynasty has to be reestablished. The temple has to be rebuilt. So somebody has to do that. So you could just say, God will do it, and God will appoint somebody who's a Davidic descendant to be the king of Israel. End of story. He doesn't have to be a Messiah. He doesn't have to be he is a Messiah. By definition, he will be anointed. He will be Mashiach, meaning the anointed one, but anointed to be a king. We don't necessarily have to expect some divine figure to come. Okay? Now, having said that, how long do we wait? Right? So we've been waiting all this time. Mashiach is coming, he's coming, he's coming, he's coming. When is he going to come? All right? How much longer do we wait? And so in every generation, as we've already seen, people always tend to interpret themselves as being in that final generation, including in the Talmud itself. The Talmud itself believed the sages of the Talmud believed themselves to be in the final generations.
But never since. For almost 2,000 years, never since. So during the Talmud,
What do you mean never? No. Wait. Let me go through all of them. Wait. So in the Talmud itself, you see many hints to perhaps an apocalyptic war that might break out between Rome and Persia, because in the Talmudic era, those were the two great superpowers. It was the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire, the Sasanian Persian Empire. So the Talmud often speaks about the wars between Rome and Persia, and is it better? There's even a passage that says, where is it better to live, under Roman dominion or under Persian dominion? Right? Where did Jews suffer more, under the Romans or under the Persians? Very an interesting discussion over there. And in the Talmud itself, they felt like Mashiach's coming is imminent. And in the same Sanhedrin, page 97, just go back one page, there's a very famous teaching there that we've mentioned before. What does it say? Tana deveh Eliyahu. It was taught in the school of Eliyahu, which is significant in itself, because remember, Eliyahu is supposed to come back and identify the Messiah. Tana deveh Eliyahu, sheshet alafim shana have alma. So the world will exist for 6,000 years, meaning civilization will exist for 6,000 years. Just a reminder, we're in the year 5783, in case you forgot. So what? No. Okay. So the world will exist, or civilization as we know it will exist for 6,000 years. The Talmud is saying this like 1,500 years ago, yeah? Even old. It's quoting an even older tradition. So the first Alpine, the first 2,000 Tohu, okay, will be the era of chaos. The first 2,000 years is the era of chaos. And then the next Alpine, the next Shnei Alafim, the next 2,000 years is the time of Torah. And then the final 2,000 years are Yamot HaMashiach. So you have 2,000 years of Tohu, chaos, 2,000 years of Torah. And so based on that, we actually know chronologically, Abraham began teaching in the year 2000, when he was 52 years old. Based on, Abraham was born in the Jewish year 1948. And so in the year 2000, when he was 52 years old, according to many, that was when he was saved from Ul Kasdim, from being thrown into the flames by the king, Nimrod, and that's when he left Ur and went to Haran and started teaching publicly, and that's when the era of Torah begins. That's when he started making souls, as the Torah says that Avram and Sarah would make souls in Haran. So he moved to Haran in the year 2000 and began teaching God's word. And so the year 2000 on the Jewish calendar begins the era of Torah, and that era of Torah continues for 2,000 years throughout the whole Tanakh and up to the conclusion of the Mishnah, because the year 4000 corresponds to the secular year 240 CE, okay? Meaning roughly 1783 years ago is the year 240, which is roughly when the Mishnah finished its compilation by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. And since then, presumably, that's when Mashiach should have come, according to this teaching of Eliyahu. Eliyahu himself said that Mashiach should come in the year 4000, but the Talmud says, Ube'avonotenu sherabu, because we were sinful, it didn't happen. We didn't merit for Mashiach to come. But it could have come in the year 4000, at the time of the conclusion of the Mishnah. And who would have been Mashiach at that point? If Mashiach would have come at that point, who would it have been in the year 240 or around then? It would be Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, because Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi was the one who compiled the Mishnah. He was a descendant of King David. He was the Nasi, so he would have been Mashiach, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. And in fact, if you read the Talmud, it seems like he did think of himself as something of a potential Messiah. He was certainly made clear that he's a descendant of King David. And in Masechet Megillah, we read that he did something, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi did something really strange. What did he do? Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, Natan Netiyah bePurim, he planted something on Purim, Verachatz Bikrona shel Tzipori b'Shiva'asar b'Tammuz, and he bathed on the 17th of Tammuz, which is a fast day. You're not supposed to bathe, technically. He bathed on a fast day. He planted on Purim. And finally, Ubikesh la'akor Tisha B'Av, and he wanted to completely nullify, cancel Tisha B'Av, when we mourn Tisha Tisha B'Av is when we mourn the destruction of the temple, and our tradition is that Tisha B'Av is when Mashiach was born, or the soul of Mashiach was born. So he said, let's just cancel it entirely. No Tisha B'Av in his generation. But they didn't listen to him. The sages said, no. Velo hodulo. The sages did not listen to him. He wanted to stop celebrating or commemorating Tisha B'Av, because we have a tradition that Mashiach will come on Tisha B'Av and it'll turn into a holiday one day. And actually, many centuries later, that's what Shabbatai Tzvi did. Shabbatai Tzvi, one of his first public displays, was actually eating on Tisha B'Av. And Shabbatai Tzvi, who lived about 400 years ago, just less than 400 years ago, who had this messianic following, he actually canceled Tisha B'Av because he believed himself to be the Messiah, and he had many followers. And at that, his followers no longer commemorated Tisha B'Av. And so he probably got the idea from Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Now, the Talmud continues and says, no, that's not actually what happened. Lo kach haya ma'aseh, ela Tisha B'Av shechal liot b'Shabbat hava. It was supposed to be that year when Tisha B'Av falls on Shabbat. What do we do when Tisha B'Av falls on Shabbat? How do we do it nowadays? You move it to Sunday. So we'll fast on Sunday. So that was the problem. And what did he say? Amar Rabbi, since we're already pushing it off to Sunday, let's just cancel it entirely. That's what he meant. He didn't really mean to cancel all of Tisha B'Av. That would have been crazy. Yeah, he only wanted to cancel it that year because it fell on Shabbat, and the sages said, okay, we'll fast on Sunday. And he said, why bother? You're already postponing it, let's just cancel it. Okay. So the sages said, okay, thank God that we have this explanation from Rabbi Abba Bar Zavda, because that makes more sense. Okay. Then, going back to Eliyahu in Sanhedrin, Tana Deve Eliyahu, it says like this: now that we missed that deadline, we missed the year 240, so now when is Mashiach going to come? Right? We missed the year 4000, so now the Talmud continues, and now it's a contemporary thing. Amar le Eliyahu le Rav Yehuda. So now Eliyahu is saying again, well, since we missed that time period, he says, En ha'olam pachot mishmonim v'chamisha yovlot, that the world will endure for at least 85 jubilees. Remember, a jubilee is 50 years. So 85 jubilees. Ubeyovel acharon ben David ba. So in Ben David will come at the last jubilee, but you have to have a minimum of 85 jubilees that'll happen first. Okay? So how many is 85 jubilees? 85. Good on the math. So 85 times 50. 85 times 50 is 4,250. So now the Talmud gave you an extra 250 years. So we missed 240, so add 250. Now we're expecting Mashiach to come in the year 490. Okay. Presumably. That's the minimum. We need to have passed at least 85 jubilees. So now we're at 490, and hopefully 490 will start the final jubilee, and at some point in that 50-year period, Mashiach will come. Why is this important? Because when was the Talmud published? Around the year 500. So the Talmud is published in the year 500, and it's telling you that we may be right now in that final jubilee. For them now, meaning back then, in the year 490, let's say the Talmud was published in 500. So in the year 500, they're saying, now is the time. Now we're in that. We've just completed 85 jubilees, and now we may be in the final jubilee. Okay. So we passed the Mishnaic date. Now we have the Talmudic date. And did it happen? Unfortunately not. Now, shortly after that, in the year 614, there actually was a legitimate, again, messianic movement by somebody called Nehemiah ben Hushiel. At that time, this is right before the Muslim conquest, and at that time Israel belonged to the Byzantines, and Nehemiah started a revolt. He was funded by a wealthy Jew named Benjamin of Tveria, and he was supported by the Persians. The Persians gave him troops, and they had a revolt, a Persian-supported revolt, and he managed to kick out the Byzantines. The king of the Byzantines at the time, the leader of the Byzantines, the emperor, was Heraclius, and he rebelled against Heraclius, kicked him out, started rebuilding the temple. But it only lasted 3 years. And in 617, the Persians stopped supporting the Jews. They betrayed them. Nehemiah was killed, and the whole thing ended. But at the time, many texts were again being written to describe him as if he is Mashiach. And when he died, that he is Mashiach ben Yosef. Remember last time we talked about Mashiach ben Yosef, who's supposed to die, and then Mashiach ben David comes. So he was viewed as Mashiach, the Mashiach ben Yosef of his day, who fought the battles and died. And so, have you heard the name Armilus? Armilus is, in our text, the one that's supposed to kill Mashiach ben Yosef. He is the adversary. Sometimes he's identified as Gog. Remember Gog uMagog? So he's called in many texts Armilus. Where does that name come from? Some say that it actually comes from Heraclius, that it's a corruption of Heraclius, that it's actually talking about Nehemiah's revolt against Heraclius and being killed by Heraclius. And so Armilus came from that. Some say it comes from Romulus, the founder of Rome. And so Armilus is this figure that represents Rome. And the Byzantines were Rome. We call them Byzantines. They didn't call themselves Byzantines, right? Byzantine is what historians refer to it as, so as not to confuse it with the Western Roman Empire, right? But they referred to it as the Eastern Roman Empire. So this was Rome. So Heraclius or Romulus is Armilus, essentially. And you see this discussed in a text from that time period called Nistarot de Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the secrets of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, which presumably dates back to Rashbi, 1800 years ago, to the students of Rabbi Akiva, but it was first published at this time in the 7th century and is describing what's going on. And it seems to really make this, that's where we see the word Armilus, maybe the first time, or one of the earliest sources where you see Armilus as this enemy. And over there it actually says something, Nistarot Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says something really interesting, because we talked about Mashiach ben Yosef and Mashiach ben David last week. Is it one Messiah? Is it two? And here it says, if the Jewish people are worthy, we will have Mashiach ben David. But if we're not worthy, we'll have Mashiach ben Yosef. So it's actually saying, here it takes the approach that it's two options. Like, if the Jewish people are not worthy, then we'll get a second-rate Mashiach ben Yosef. And if the Jewish people are worthy, then we'll get the Mashiach ben David that we want. Okay? So that's another possibility to the two Messiahs idea. And you know that in our Sidurim, there's a kavanah, at least in the Sephardi Sidurim, in the Nusach HaArizal, there's kavanot. If you have a Sidur with kavanot, where when you say the blessing for Jerusalem, what's the kavanah over there? It says, it's from Shara Kavanot, the Arizal says, Uveomro ukiseh David avdecha me'era betochat achin, when we say those verses to reestablish the throne of David, tzarich lechaven, you have to have a kavanah, you have to have in your mind, you have to have an intention, shebechol yom v'yom lekaven leitpalel, to pray to God, al Mashiach ben Yosef sheyichyeh velo yamot. That you should pray, you should have a kavanah that hopefully Mashiach ben Yosef will live and not die. That he will not be killed by Al Yadei Armilus the Rasha. Who knows? I think the Arizal holds that, the Arizal for sure holds that Mashiach ben Yosef and Mashiach ben David are two distinct individuals. In fact, not only does he hold that, but it's pretty clear that the Arizal considered himself Mashiach ben Yosef and Chaim Vital, his disciple, as Mashiach ben David of their generation. At least that seems to be what Rav Chaim Vital thinks. He thought of himself from his writings. Rav Chaim Vital thought of himself as Mashiach ben David and his teacher, the Arizal, as Mashiach ben Yosef. The potential of the generation. There was no messianic movement around them, but as the potential ones of their generation. Okay. Makes sense? So you see again that in every generation, people are kind of interpreting it in their own way. Now, I have many more, but we're going to skip ahead a little bit. If you want to go through all of the different calculations, I recommend one book. It's called A History of Messianic Speculation. It's an old book, and it's already has no copyright on it. You can get it for free online. It was written by a rabbi named Abba Hillel Silver. Abba Hillel Silver was actually originally Orthodox. He went to yeshiva, what is today Yeshiva University, and he was an Orthodox rabbi, but he became the leader of a Reform synagogue. Now, he did good, because actually back then Reform was very left. Conservative was more Orthodox than it is today. Conservative has gone leftward, and Reform has gone a little rightward, actually.
What?
Yeah. Back then Reform was really left. And you know how left? When Abba Hillel Silver took over this Reform synagogue, you know when they kept Shabbat? on Sunday,
On Sunday.
with the Christians. They actually went to shul, well, to their temple.
So now they don't keep it
on.
at all.
They went to temple on Sunday. No, I'm saying since then, Reform went back to keeping it on Shabbat.
They don't keep anything.
And remember, they call it a temple. The Reform call it a temple because they have abandoned the belief in Mashiach either and the rebuilding of the third temple. They say their synagogue is the temple. So it's not a shul anymore.
They abandoned the idea of God also.
Yeah.
But anyway, so Abba Hillel Silver, when he took over this Reform congregation, he actually fixed it in many ways. He moved Shabbat back to Shabbat. He made it back to Saturday. He instituted more Orthodox rules, and he played a very important role in the Zionist movement. At the time, Reform was also very anti-Zionist, and he helped to transform Reform Judaism, make it more Zionistic, and he played a huge role in the establishment of Israel. In fact, they say that if the runner-up, when they were picking the first president of Israel, Chaim Weizmann was the first president, but the runner-up was Abba Hillel Silver. So he was a really big figure. Anyway, he was also a great scholar, and he wrote a book called The History of Messianic Speculation. And if you really, Mamash goes through everybody. He
When was
says,
this written?
like 100 years ago, probably. Yeah, it's an old book. And he goes through like every single one, what every rabbi said, and the Rambam calculated this, and Rabbeinu Bechaya calculated this, and this Midrash says this, and he gives all the calculations one after the other. It's really a fascinating read. And the Rambam is an interesting case, because the Rambam was very harsh against, although we said that he made it a fundamental principle that you have to believe in Mashiach, he also made it a fundamental principle never to calculate when Mashiach might come. Never speculate. He was very adamant against doing it. And yet, we have one of his letters to Yemen. The Yemenites were suffering a lot. There was forced conversion. The Muslims really tortured them. And they said, no, when is salvation going to come? When is Mashiach going to come? So despite the fact that the Rambam said you should never calculate, and you're a terrible person if you do this, nonetheless, he wanted to give them hope. And this is what he writes in the letter. I'm quoting him. He says, the exact time is not known for sure, but there exists among us a great and wonderful tradition, which I received from my father, and he from his father, and his grandfather, who received it through a continuous chain to the beginning of the exile from Jerusalem. So he's saying this is an ancient tradition, that in Bilam's statement in Parashat Balak, when it talks about whatever it is, that prophecy of Bilam, the Rambam says, from the time of that prophecy, one should count the number of years which preceded it from creation. Prophecy will at that time return to Israel, and the prophets will say, behold what God has wrought. This prophecy of Bilam was delivered 40 years after the Exodus, which is the Jewish year 2488. The return of prophecy, which is the sign heralding the coming of the Messiah, will transpire in the year 4976, meaning double it. He's saying that the time that elapsed between creation and Bilam is the time that will elapse between Bilam and Mashiach. And the return of prophecy. Which would correspond to the year 1216. So the Rambam is saying that Mashiach is coming very soon, like 1216. And just to put that in perspective, he passed away in 1204. So just, he didn't live to see what he thought would be the timing of when prophecy would return to Israel. And then Eliyahu would return and Mashiach. Okay. So that was the Rambam. So even the Rambam made a calculation that he himself opposed, that we shouldn't make calculations. Okay. Now, the Rambam also says something really interesting, which he says that you shouldn't make calculations because we really don't know. And he even makes a comment that even the exile in Egypt, or the suffering that we had in Egypt, even with that, we're not quite sure how long we were slaves in Egypt. We're not quite sure how long that was. And this is where I want to really get to. This is what all of that was an introduction to this. Because how long were we in Egypt? And we've mentioned before that the Kabbalists say that the final generation is a reincarnation of the Egypt generation. And what's happening in the world today is very much what happened back then. And so, what happened in Egypt? How long were we really there? Did God save us early, or did God save us late? How long do we wait for?
Slavery, 210 years of
86, yeah.
Oh, sorry, 86. Right.
So look, our tradition, and you've heard this all, our tradition and the Jewish calendar is built on this. The year is 5783 because we count that the Israelites spent a total of 210 years in Egypt. 210 years. Because when you count all the generations, who gave birth to who, it works out to 210. So there's almost like no denying it. And we even say that there's a hint to this numerologically, because when Yaakov said to go down to Egypt, he used the word redu. And the gematria of redu, descend, reish daled vav, is 210. So we say that there's a prophetically that he already kind of made a hint that they are going to descend to Egypt for 210 years. And when you count up the generations, it's 210. Our accepted tradition and our calendar is built on this. The year 5783 is based on the fact that we spent 210 years in Egypt. Now, why is that a problem? Because when you read in the Torah itself, the words of the Torah, it says, Umoshav bnei Israel asher yashvu b'Mitzrayim, and the settlement of Israel, that they were in Egypt. It's undeniable. 30 shana ve'arba shana, 430 years. Whoa. They were in Egypt 430 years. And in case you were doubting it, the Torah repeats it again. And the next verse says, Ve'i miketz 30 shana ve'arba shana. And it was specifically after 430 years. Ve'i be'etzem hayom hazeh, on that day, yatzu kol tzivot Hashem me'eretz Mitzrayim. That's when God's legions came out of Egypt. So, the Torah makes it pretty clear that Israel, yashvu, that Bnei Israel yashvu b'Mitzrayim 430 years. But wait a second, but we calculate 210. These are two undeniable facts. On the one hand, when you count the chronology, it's 210. On the other hand, when you read the pasuk, the pshat, it's 430. How can they both be true? It seems like we can't deny either one. They're both, denying either one is a problem, because they're both based on the Torah.
And the other refers to Tzivot Hashem.
No, but the first pasuk says, Umoshav bnei Israel asher yashvu b'Mitzrayim. So we know how our rabbis dealt with it by saying, well, no, 430 counts from when God told Abraham the prophecy, and fine, you can do that like mental gymnastics, but it doesn't satisfy this, because it says Moshav b'nei Israel. It says literally that the children of Israel, not Yitzchak, not Avraham, the children of Yaakov. Yeah, we mentioned before that one way of dealing with it is to say, we can say the souls of Israel went there 430 years earlier. So when God told Abraham that your descendants will be slaves, God already sent the souls spiritually to be there, the future souls of Israel. Fine. But we can't deny the pshat. The pshat is that it's 430 years. So now, what do I want to do with this? Why do I bring it up? Because,
so add that to the 210. What does that mean?
by the way, just so you know, the Midrash supports 430 years. Even though the rabbinic tradition is 210, there are other Midrashic sources that support 430, that take that as at face value. For example, and you've heard this Midrash before, you remember the Midrash that among the tribe of Ephraim, there was a group that left 30 years early. You remember this Midrash? And they were all killed. They all died in the wilderness. And when Ezekiel, Yecheskel, saw the vision of the dry bones, God took him to the wilderness and showed him the bones coming back to life. Right. Who were those bones? Who were those skeletons? We say, the Midrash says, those were the bones of the children of Ephraim, of the Bnei Ephraim, who left 30 years early. They didn't wait to be saved by God. Why did they leave 30 years early? Because they had a prophecy from Abraham that your children will be slaves for 400 years. That your children will be in a foreign land for 400 years. So the Bnei Ephraim, after 400 years, said, hey, time's up. We've been here 400 years. Let's go. And so they left early, 30 years early, after 400, and were all killed. And then Ezekiel saw them come back to life and be resurrected. Right? That the Midrash says that. So that Midrash, and we've all heard it. It's a very popular one. That Midrash is based on the fact that they really were in Egypt 430 years. And that Bnei Ephraim left, or a portion of that tribe, left 30 years early. Now, why is this important? Why does this matter? The 430 or the 210. So let's be out of the box for a second. Okay, this requires going out of the box. The year is 5783. We know that. There's no disputing that. Your calendar says so. However, that's based on the 210 years. But what if we go with the pshat of the Torah and with those midrashim that say that they were there for 430 years? That means we'd have to add 220. We would have to add 220 years to our counting, which means that we're not in 5783. It means that we're in 6003, which means we've already passed 6,000. Tana Deve Eliyahu, it's 6,000 years of civilization. That's another fundamental Jewish belief. So could it be that we've already passed 6,000? The 430 interpretation, by the way, or the 430 reading of the Torah, is the simplest and clearest. Because when you read it that way, it makes a lot of sense. Because there, the Jewish people, the Israelites, expected to be in Egypt 400 years. The deadline passed, and where is the salvation? And 30 years later, they're still not saved. And that's why they've completely given up hope. They've totally given up hope and said, it's not happening. And that's why God is saying, I know, God knew that the people groaned and cried to God, where are you, God? And God knew. What does it mean, and God knew? He knew that the deadline has passed. And that's why the people are suffering. Right? So the way we usually say it is God took them out early. But another way of saying it, which is more in line with the Pshat, is no, he took them out late. He left them there a little extra time.
Well done.
And so the people were totally hopeless. They felt like it's over. It's not happening. And so I bring that up because now we're kind of in the same reality where we've given up hope, where it's been so long and all these calculations have come and gone and everything's passed. And it's like people are already saying, like I just said earlier, 20 minutes ago, do you have to believe in a Mashiach anymore? Maybe we don't have to believe in it anymore. That people are totally losing hope in this idea because we're already over time on Mashiach. And so could it be 30 years late? I don't know. Is it going to be 6,030? Or if we go with 5783 and we say God took us out of Egypt 190 years early, and the same thing will happen now, so take us out 190 years early now. So subtract 190 from 6,000 and you're at 5810. Either way, it's like now it should be imminent, meaning I don't want to be like the Rambam writing this letter to the Yemenites, but it should be within, like either way, any way you slice it, it's like it's got to be in the next few decades tops. You know what I mean? Depending on, regardless of which calculation you go with. And the truth is that never before have all the prophecies been fulfilled like today. In every generation, yes, they saw themselves as now all these prophecies are being fulfilled. But never until now have all the prophecies really come true, including things like, how does a Mashiach rule the whole world? If he's going to be a king for the whole planet, even 200 years ago, that would have been impossible. But today, with today's communication and today's technology, it's quite possible and quite likely. So never before has there really been a full potential for Mashiach to come, for everybody to be able to go to Israel, right? Like the prophecies also say that in the end of days when Mashiach comes, all the peoples of the world will come to Jerusalem. So that wasn't possible before modern transportation and communication and all these things. So, and health. And when Isaiah says that in the Messianic age, a person who's 100 years old will be like young like a baby. People will live so long. We're getting there. We're getting to the point where in terms of medicine and health and so on, that people will be able to live long lives. There's a lot of amazing scientific work being done on this, of finding different compounds that can extend our life and even reverse aging. They were able to take 2-year-old mice and make them as if the people who did the study said that they were able to make them like 6-month-old mice. They said it was like the equivalent of making a 60-year-old a 20-year-old. So there is this research being done on longevity with telomeres, with hydrogen sulfide, and there's all these different things being explored, and we never hear about them going commercially because it probably doesn't fit the agenda of the people in power to make everybody immortal. Probably they actually want to do the opposite. But nonetheless, it's coming. The technology is there. So I think never before has there been an ability for that messianic age to actually take place. So now for sure we are at the end of history and all the prophecies really have been fulfilled, every single one, and we've passed all the deadlines. So it's got to be now or never.
Like, if God waited too long to take us out of Egypt, and we were so hopeless, why do it again? Like, you know what I mean? Like, the whole thing was, no, he took us
It's a good
before
question.
because we were so lost. We were like almost unredeemable. So why do it again? Like, people are really
I guess it's necessary. I guess you need people
that's
to
the-
be so hopeless.
Right.
And
To receive actually.
let's be honest, life in the 90s was fantastic. And now, in just the past 30 years, the world has just turned upside down.
Yes.
Right? So, in the 90s, we weren't hopeless. We were having a great time.
When things are good, we're not ready to watch.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's necessary to have that real yearning. Then it'll really be, you will feel the catharsis of salvation, like, wow,
This
you know.
is difficult because you say 90s, but depending where in the world you're 90s.
Well, I mean, for us, of course, in the Western world, yes. I had one of my history teacher, I think I mentioned this maybe, he had a thesis called the Clinton bubble. My history teacher argued that the greatest era of human history was the Clinton years. The Cold War was over, like Clinton and Yeltsin were like drinking together, Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin were drinking together, there was peace processes everywhere, the United States had a budgetary surplus, the economy was booming, everything seemed great, there was no smartphones yet, the minds weren't corrupted, and life was still simple, that we still were outside and not always tethered to a phone, houses were cheap. Yeah, we had just the right amount of technology where it was like excellent. So that's why I had this teacher who would say that the 90s were the best. The Clinton bubble was the best generation. I make fun of my students all the time because I'll bring something up and I'll say, oh, you guys, it's too bad that you're not a 90s kid like me, you don't. And they tell me that. They tell me that, oh, it's too bad we're not 90s kids. They tell me this. So, yeah, I think, I guess it was necessary. Who knows? We don't know what God thinks. And as it's said in many places, im yeda'ati va'itiv. If I knew God's mind, I would be God. So we can't answer why, but apparently it's necessary. Okay, we'll end it there. Thank you very much.